Now picture yourself in a dimly lit theater, your heart racing as a shadow creeps down a corridor on a screen. You're waiting for the inevitable scare, anticipating the rush of adrenaline. This is classic horror, a genre meant to instill the most raw and primal of all human emotions: fear. You are there to be scared, to feel that primal thrill of horror, the kind of fear that makes your heart pound and keeps you awake at night. But instead, you're met with an unfolding metaphor about trauma or a drawn-out exploration of existential dread. The horror is buried under layers of symbolism, dissecting the human psyche instead of simply scaring you. Some might argue that this makes horror more sophisticated, but has horror lost its way by trying to be too deep? In a genre born from shock and suspense, is there still room for straightforward terror without intellectual pretension? In this video, I'll make my case against psychological horror, arguing that horror films should focus on the visceral experience rather than showboating with layers of intellectual themes. Horror at its core is about evoking fear, suspense, and excitement. It's an ancient genre that speaks to our primal instincts, tapping into the universal human thrill of danger and survival. Films like Halloween and The Nightmare on Elm Street embody this spirit by focusing on relentless suspense and bone-chilling villains. They understand that horror is most powerful when it's simple and direct. Instead of layering in philosophical themes, these movies deliver pure terror designed to make viewers squirm, scream, and brace for impact. Psychological horror, however, often veers away from this immediate collective experience. It introduces character backstories and thematic complexity, drawing audiences into elaborate emotional or moral explorations. Films like Midsommar, The Babadook, and Hereditary are not merely about fear. They are heavy with symbolism, reflecting on trauma, grief, and mental anguish. While there is merit in exploring these issues, the focus on intellectual depth can dilute the core experience of horror itself, leaving audiences analyzing rather than feeling. This leads me to my next point. Psychological horror has at times become a platform for filmmakers to demonstrate intellectual and thematic sophistication. In films like Mother, The Lighthouse, and Enemy, horror becomes more about unraveling abstract imagery and symbolism than experiencing true fear. Mother is laden with biblical allegory and environmental themes, but its heavy-handed metaphors and surrealist style makes it feel like a cerebral puzzle than a horror film. The intention seems to be to impress with complexity than to provoke with fear, turning horror into a showcase of thematic density. Similarly, The Lighthouse blends elements of horror with existential dread, mythological symbolism, and themes of isolation and insanity. While it may be haunting, the layers of intellectual storytelling sometimes overshadow the horror, leaving audiences more perplexed than terrified. Enemy does something similar, using surreal imagery and Kafkaesque motifs to explore themes of identity and fear of self. These films blur genre lines and lean heavily on cerebral themes, but in doing so, they often lose the visceral, immediate impact that makes horror so engaging. Classic horror doesn't rely on layers of subtext to make its point. Films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Friday the 13th show that terror doesn't need a metaphor. They rely on simplicity and atmosphere, creating horror that's universal and instantly accessible. Movies like It Follows maintain simplicity, even as they add symbolic undertones. The film creates a terrifying sense of dread without forcing viewers to deconstruct complex narratives. It remains grounded in fear. By contrast, films like Saint Maud and Black Swan are psychological horror experiences that delve deeply into character psychology, existential fears, and religious fanaticism. While these elements are undoubtedly haunting, they shift the focus from fear to thematic exploration. The immediate horror is often lost amid existential or religious introspection, leaving you, the audience, wondering if the film's primary goal was to scare them or to simply make you think. Psychological horror's intellectual depth often leaves viewers isolated from the communal experience of horror. Films like Annihilation, which combines psychological horror with sci-fi, immerse viewers in dense symbolism around themes of self-destruction and transformation. The alienating nature of the film's metaphors and mind-bending scenes demands a level of introspection and analysis that doesn't appeal to everyone. For audiences seeking the communal, visceral thrill of a scare, this intellectual focus can feel disappointing. Similarly, The Witch explores themes of religious hysteria and family disintegration, but its slow pacing and symbolic depth create a sense of detachment rather than pure fear. These films don't invite viewers to share a collective experience of terror. Instead, they require introspective engagement, which can isolate those who crave the direct emotional experience that horror traditionally provides. When horror becomes a tedious intellectual exercise, it loses its universal primal appeal. In conclusion, while psychological horror films strive to provide complexity and sophistication, they often feel like exercises in artistic posturing rather than attempts to genuinely scare. By focusing on intellectual themes, these films risk alienating audiences and diluting the immediate thrilling experience that defines the genre. Horror should evoke fear and suspense, not intellectual acrobatics. True horror doesn't need showboating, it needs simplicity, fear, and a reminder of the mysteries lurking just beyond the edge of the screen. That's just my opinion.